Hi, my name is Riley James. I'll be talking to you about why do people even lease a car. So people usually lease a car because it's cheaper. You get a new vehicle out of it, and most people can afford that payment instead of like financing a vehicle where the payment's a little bit more. But in the end, leasing a car is definitely more expensive than purchasing it. So leasing a car is a bad idea in the long run, as you are basically renting the car. You're not building really any equity in the car like you would be if you were financing it or buying the car. So today I'll be discussing with you the history of a lease, how it became so popular, or why it became so popular, the limitations of leasing, and why basically you're just renting it. So let's jump right into the history of leasing a car. So who created leasing? The person who created leasing was Zolly Frank. She started the long-term leasing of cars in 1914. So what is leasing? So leasing is an option available to people pretty much with good credit to get into a new car at less of a cost than if you were buying it. Leasing is basically renting, so you pay for a car, you're paying for a car, and at the end of the lease you're returning it because it's not yours. So why is leasing so popular? Leasing is popular because it allows people to get more expensive cars than what they could afford if they were to buy or finance it. And also at the end of the lease, you don't really have to worry about selling the car because you just return it. So now that we know a little bit about the history, let's go right into the limitations of leasing. So a limitation of leasing is the mileage. You have a certain amount of miles you can drive each year. So for example, you can drive 10,000, 12,000, or 15,000 a year. And depending on which one you go to, your payment could be more or less. So if you choose 10,000, your payment will be less than if you have 15,000 miles a year. And right around the 15, your payment might already be the same price as like if you were to finance or buy the car. And also, if you were to get the 10,000 or 12,000, the average miles driven per year in 2018 was around 13,500, so you'd be expecting to pay overages if you chose those. And also another one is credit. So to lease and to get into a good lease, you have to have very good credit to where if you were to buy or finance a vehicle, you can have not as good credit but still get financed. Another thing is customization. So you are limited to the things you can customize on a car because you're renting it, it's not yours. And dealerships usually like to keep them stocked because the more you modify or customize a car, the smaller your market becomes for someone to come and buy the car. And dealerships don't like to keep cars on their lot very long. Another thing you can't do when leasing is modify the engine, as that voids the warranty, to where if you were to finance or buy, you can modify the engine all you want, it just voids the warranty, but it's your car, you can do whatever you want. Another thing is if you exit the lease early. There's not really many options if you exit the lease early compared to if you were to finance or buy the vehicle, because if you finance or buy, you can get out of it by selling the car or trading it in, and you won't have any penalties or fees for getting out of that. And for leasing, if you exit out of the lease early, you might have fees or penalties such as remaining payments due on the lease, or if you have to cover the negative equity on the car. So while limitations can be restrictive, there are more you should consider, like that you will never truly own the car, and as long as you lease, you always have a car payment. So basically, leasing is renting, so you have to give the car back in the end, and at the end of the lease, you can either choose to buy the car or get into another lease. But if you do buy it, you can buy it for what the residual value was when you first signed the lease, which is your buyout pretty much. And if you decide to buy or finance, you can build equity into the car and eventually own it outright. And at the end of the lease, you must give it back or buy the car. Another thing is when you give the car back, you can run into fees. One of them is blemishes. So if a blemish or scratch or dent is bigger than a credit card, dealerships will usually charge you a fee to get that fixed because the car needs to be in a pristine condition for them to sell it. And another is if you go over the miles you're allowed on your contract. So if you go over 10,000 a year, at the end you have to pay a per mile fee, which can add up. So if you go, for example, you go over 1,200 miles and the per mile fee is 30 cents, that's around $360 in fees that you have to pay on mileage. Another thing is leasing is more expensive than purchasing, and you have to understand your contract a lot better than if you were to finance, because you have to look closely at the contract and what it's saying and make sure you understand everything so you don't get any surprises like the fees or anything. Because if you do and you don't read the contract right, you can end up being in a big hole to where you can only really buy the car, or you have to pay a ton of money up front to get into another lease. The leasing contract is different than a financing contract because in a leasing one you will have the residual value, which is what you can buy the car for, finance it for in the end of your lease, and also your taxes are included in your monthly payment. So now that we've talked about the essentials of renting a car, now let's recap everything. So in conclusion, in the long run, it's not really a good idea to lease a vehicle because the cons outweigh the pros, and leasing will cost more, and even though it sounds like it's a great deal because your payments are going to be super low, you're renting the car, so it's not really a good deal at all. And leasing has become popular as a cheaper way to get into a newer vehicle, more expensive vehicle, or even like a luxury vehicle because it's like renting. But you will have many limitations and may have fees when you have to return the car. So people lease cars so they can have a reasonable payment and have a warranty. And as well, you can get a new car out of it for a lot cheaper than if you were to finance or buy it. But leasing is dangerous and costs more in the end. Thank you.